We had only been in the new house for about a week when the strange things started happening. My wife Sarah and I had moved into a quiet suburban neighborhood. It was the kind of place we'd always wanted, quiet with lots of space and a cozy, unfinished basement. I imagined using it as a workshop someday, maybe fixing it up when we got settled. But that basement turned out to be a lot more than we bargained for. It started with the door. One night, Sarah and I were watching a movie in the living room when we heard a faint creaking sound. We paused the movie, thinking it might be something outside, maybe a branch brushing against the house. But then it happened again. This time it was clearer. The sound of the basement door slowly creaking open. I thought maybe it was a draft, even though it seemed odd since we hadn't noticed it before. I got up, walked over, and shut the door firmly, making sure it latched. I went back to the couch thinking that was the end of it, but it wasn't, not by a long shot. A couple of nights later, I was alone at home. Sarah was out with friends, and I decided to spend the evening just relaxing, maybe going through a few boxes we hadn't unpacked yet. Around 10 p.m., I heard it again, the unmistakable sound of the basement door creaking open. I tried to brush it off, but my gut told me something wasn't right. I went over, shut the door again, and this time I locked it. But as soon as I turned to walk away, I felt this strange sensation, like something was watching me from the other side. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself it was just my imagination, but then I heard a faint tapping from the basement. It was rhythmic, almost deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. I took a deep breath and tried to ignore it, telling myself it had to be the house settling or pipes rattling. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. I could feel something in my bones, something unsettling. That night I barely slept, keeping an ear out for any more strange noises. I told Sarah about it the next morning, but she just laughed it off, saying I was just stressed from the move. A few nights later, Sarah was home alone. I was working late, and I got a frantic call from her around midnight. She sounded shaken and told me that the basement door had been wide open when she got back from the kitchen. She swore she'd closed it earlier and even put a chair in front of it because of the weird noises we'd been hearing. But somehow the door was wide open and the chair was pushed to the side. I left work immediately and rushed home. When I got there, Sarah was still visibly upset, clutching a blanket on the couch. She kept saying she heard noises down in the basement, like someone shuffling around or breathing. We decided we needed to check it out together, so I grabbed a flashlight and we headed down the creaky stairs. The basement was just as we'd left it, with piles of unpacked boxes and some old furniture from the previous owners. There was nothing out of place, but as we stood there in the silence, I felt this heavy, almost suffocating sense of dread. We left quickly, locking the door behind us. For the next few weeks, we tried to avoid going down there, but the door continued to open on its own. One night, we even bolted it, thinking that would solve the problem. But somehow, the door would still be open, and the bolt was always unlocked, like someone or something was down there. We started hearing that faint tapping noise more frequently, like it was getting closer and closer. I began to dread being in the house alone, constantly glancing at the basement door, wondering if it would swing open. Sarah suggested we get someone to check for drafts or structural issues, but no one could explain the strange sounds or the way the door kept opening on its own. One night, I finally decided to put a camera outside the basement door, hoping to catch whatever was causing it to open. We set it up, hit record, and went to bed. The next morning, I checked the footage. There was nothing, just silence, except for the door slowly creaking open around 3 a.m., as if guided by an invisible hand. But there was something else. Right before the door creaked open, I heard a faint whisper on the recording. It sounded like my name, just barely audible but unmistakable. I froze as I replayed it over and over, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I don't know what's down in that basement or why it seems to have fixated on us. All I know is that every time I walk by that door, I can't shake the feeling that something is waiting on the other side, watching and waiting for the moment when we finally let our guard down. That was over a year ago. To this day, we've stopped trying to keep the door closed, and we've accepted that whatever it is, it doesn't want to leave. When Emma and I bought our new house, we were beyond excited. It was a little older, with plenty of character, and the bedroom had these large windows that looked out into the backyard. Emma loved that window from the start. She always imagined lying in bed at night, looking up at the stars or watching the sunrise in the morning. But within a few weeks, the feeling of peace we'd initially had in the house started to fade. The first strange thing happened about a month after we moved in. It was a Wednesday night around 3 a.m., and I was jolted awake by this strange feeling, like something was off. As I glanced over, I noticed that the window was open, letting in a cold breeze that shouldn't have been there. Emma was still asleep, and I remember thinking, did I leave it open? I could have sworn we'd closed it before bed. I got up, shut it, and tried to brush it off as an oversight. The next morning, I asked Emma if she'd opened it, and she looked at me like I was crazy. She swore up and down that she hadn't touched the window all week. It was strange, but I let it go, chalking it up to me simply forgetting. A few nights later, the same thing happened. I woke up, and there it was, the window wide open and a cold breeze creeping into the room. I started feeling uneasy, but I didn't want to worry Emma. I shut it again and went back to bed, though I lay there awake, listening to the sounds of the night, wondering if something or someone was messing with us. Things only got worse from there. Emma began having these vivid nightmares, ones where she'd wake up, convinced that someone was watching her from outside the window. She told me she'd dream about a dark figure standing there, staring in, but when she'd get up to check, there was never anything there. It was starting to get to both of us, and we found ourselves dreading the night. One evening, Emma went to bed early, so I stayed up to finish some work in the living room. Around midnight, I heard her scream, a blood-curdling scream that had me sprinting up the stairs, heart pounding. When I burst into the room, she was sitting up in bed, her face pale and her eyes wide with terror. She pointed to the window and stammered, There was someone standing right there." I looked out, but of course, there was nothing. I tried to calm her down, telling her it was probably just another nightmare. But deep down, I was starting to feel that chill again, that creeping suspicion that something wasn't right. That night, I stayed up by her side, watching the window until dawn. The next day, I decided to install some motion sensor lights outside and double-checked all the locks. But the sense of dread in the house didn't go away. A few nights later, we were both asleep, when once again I woke up around 3 a.m. This time, I wasn't alone in waking up. Emma sat up as well, her eyes fixed on the window. The window was open, but this time something was different. The latch was broken, almost as if it had been forced open. Emma clutched my arm, whispering that she could hear footsteps outside. I listened, straining my ears, and sure enough, there was this faint sound, almost like someone shuffling just outside the window. I grabbed my flashlight and, heart pounding, I cautiously went to the window, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever was out there. But as I looked out, all I saw was darkness and the faint outline of trees. I thought I saw something move, a shadow slipping away into the night, but it was so quick I couldn't be sure. After that, we both struggled to sleep, the anxiety gnawing away at us. One night, Emma suggested that we set up a camera to capture whatever was happening. I wasn't sure it would help, but I figured it couldn't hurt, so we set up a small camera aimed at the window, hitting record before we went to bed. The next morning, we checked the footage together. At first, there was nothing, just the two of us falling asleep. But around 3 a.m., the window started to creak, moving ever so slightly. And then, we saw it, this dark shape, just outside the window, leaning in, as if trying to peer through the glass. The figure seemed to hover there, unmoving, watching. Emma gasped, covering her mouth as we watched the figure shift slightly, almost as if it was pressing its face against the window. We sat there horrified, as it seemed to linger for a few minutes before fading back into the shadows, disappearing as silently as it had come. We called the police, but they didn't find any evidence of forced entry or footprints outside. It was as if whatever it was had left no trace. After that night, we couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone in that house, that something or someone was waiting for us to let our guard down. Eventually, we decided we couldn't take it anymore. We moved out within the month, leaving behind whatever was haunting that window. But sometimes when I think back to that footage, to the shadowy figure watching us as we slept. I can't help but wonder if it's still there, waiting for the next family to move in. When I bought my new house, I was beyond excited. It was a cozy two-story place in a quiet neighborhood, and it even had a basement, a perfect spot for extra storage and maybe a game room someday. But the basement had this vibe. It felt colder than the rest of the house, and I figured it was just because it was underground. It had this odd, musty smell, like it hadn't been aired out in a long time. I didn't think too much of it at the time, and after moving in, I stored a few boxes down there and didn't plan to go down often. The first strange thing happened maybe a week after I'd settled in. I was getting ready to go to bed when I heard a faint noise coming from the basement. It was this strange dragging sound, like something heavy being moved across the concrete floor. I tried to brush it off as just the house settling, but every night after that, around the same time, I'd hear it again. It got to the point where I couldn't ignore it anymore. One night around 1 a.m., I worked up the courage to go down there and check it out. I flicked on the light, and as I crept down the stairs, I could feel the air get colder. When I reached the bottom, I scanned the room, and everything looked normal, until I noticed that some of the boxes I'd stacked against the wall had been moved. They weren't just slightly shifted either. They'd been dragged to the middle of the room, like someone had deliberately moved them. I was pretty freaked out, but I pushed the boxes back against the wall, convinced myself it was nothing, and headed back upstairs, double locking the basement door behind me. But from that night on, things only got weirder. Every night, I'd hear the same noises coming from below: dragging, footsteps, and even faint tapping. The worst part was, every time I went down to check, I'd find the boxes in different spots, like someone was playing some twisted game with me. I tried setting up a camera in the basement one night, hoping to catch whatever was causing the disturbance. I reviewed the footage the next day, but all I saw was the empty room, with the boxes somehow shifting slightly on their own, almost like something invisible was moving them. After about 2 weeks of this, I started sleeping with my bedroom door locked. One night, I was lying in bed, half asleep, when I heard a creak that sounded different. It wasn't from the basement. It was from the top of the basement stairs, right outside my door. I sat up, straining to listen, and that's when I heard it. Slow, heavy footsteps. They were moving down the hallway, right toward my room. I was frozen, too terrified to move, and then the footsteps stopped, right outside my door. I could feel this intense sense of dread, like something was just standing there, waiting. After a long, tense moment, the footsteps started again, this time retreating back down the hall and down the stairs to the basement. I stayed up the rest of the night, barely able to breathe, let alone sleep. By the time morning came, I'd had enough. I decided to call a friend and asked him to stay over, hoping that maybe having someone else there would help me feel safer. That night, we both stayed up late, waiting to see if the noises would happen again. Sure enough, around 1 a.m., we heard the dragging sounds coming from the basement. My friend looked at me, wide-eyed, and I could tell he was just as creeped out as I was. We both crept down the stairs together, flashlights in hand, and when we reached the basement, we saw it. In the far corner of the room, just out of reach of our flashlights, was a dark figure. It was tall, hunched over, and motionless, almost blending in with the shadows. My friend whispered, "Do you see that?" But I couldn't even respond. The figure just stood there watching us, its eyes barely visible in the darkness. And then, without a sound, it slowly turned and seemed to dissolve into the wall, disappearing as if it had never been there. We bolted up the stairs, slamming the basement door behind us. We didn't sleep that night, and by morning, I'd made up my mind. I was done with that house. I called a realtor the next day and put it on the market, no questions asked. I moved out within a week, leaving whatever was down in that basement behind. I'll never forget those nights or the feeling of being watched. I don't know what it was in that basement, but I'm glad I'll never have to find out.